August 1887, Arizona Territory. The sun blazed mercilessly over the endless desert as Margaret O'Brien collapsed, for the third time that morning, her worn boots scraping against the rocky ground. Blood stained her torn dress and her lips were cracked like old leather. She had walked for days without food, carrying nothing but a small satchel of books and the desperate hope that civilization lay somewhere beyond the next ridge. In the distance, dust clouds swirled where a lone horseman approached, a sight that would either mean her salvation or her doom in this unforgiving wilderness, where only the strongest survived. Margaret O'Brien had never imagined that accepting a teaching position in the small town of Copper Creek would lead her to this moment, stumbling through the Arizona desert with blistered feet and an empty stomach. 3 weeks earlier, she had stepped off the dusty stagecoach in what was supposed to be her new home, clutching her teaching certificate and a heart full of dreams. The town of Copper Creek had looked promising in the recruitment letter. A growing community in need of an educated woman to teach our children, it had said. The salary promised was modest but fair, $30 a month plus room and board. For a young woman from Boston who had lost both parents to consumption the previous winter, it seemed like Providence itself. But when Margaret arrived, she found a town dying faster than tumbleweeds in a drought. The copper mine that had given the place its name had played out months ago. Most families had already packed up and headed east or west, seeking better fortunes. The few remaining residents could barely feed themselves, let alone pay a teacher's wages. Old Pete Henderson, who served as both mayor and general store owner, had met her at the stagecoach with apologetics and empty pockets. "I'm mighty sorry, Miss O'Brien," he had said, his weathered hands twisting his hat brim. "We sent that letter back in the spring when things looked different. Ain't no school to teach in now, and ain't nominee to pay you with." Margaret had spent her last $15 on the Stagecoach ticket west. She had sold everything she owned back in Boston to make this journey. The reality hit her like a physical blow. She was stranded in a ghost town with no way home and no means of survival. For 3 days, she had wandered the empty streets of Copper Creek, sleeping in the abandoned schoolhouse and drinking water from the town well. The few remaining families had offered what little kindness they could spare. A biscuit here, a cup of coffee there, but they were barely surviving themselves. On the 4th morning, old Pete had approached her with news that chilled her to the bone. "Stage ain't coming back through here for another 2 months, miss," he had said. "And when it does, it'll cost you $20 to get back to Phoenix." 20 might as well have been 20,000. Margaret had counted her remaining coins that morning. $1.37. Not even enough for a proper meal, let alone passage anywhere. That's when she made the decision that had led her to this desert trail. She would walk to Tombstone, the nearest substantial town, some 100 red miles south. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only plan she had. Tombstone was a booming mining town with saloons, hotels, and surely opportunities for an educated woman to find work. Mrs. Clara Hutchins, one of the last remaining wives in Copper Creek, had tried to talk her out of it. "That's wild country between here and there, child," she had warned. "Apache territory and worse. Ain't no place for a young lady alone." But Margaret had already made up her mind. She packed her few belongings in a small satchel. 2 books, her teaching certificate, a change of clothes, and a small silver locket that had belonged to her mother. Mrs. Hutchins had insisted she take a jar of water and what little food could be spared. 3 biscuits and a handful of dried beans. The first day of walking had been the hardest on her feet, but the easiest on her spirit. She had felt strong, determined, even hopeful. The Arizona landscape was unlike anything she had seen in Massachusetts. Vast, harsh, but beautiful in its own way. Red rocks jutted up from the earth like ancient monuments, and the sky seemed to stretch forever in all directions. By the second day, the romance of the adventure had worn thin. The sun was relentless, and her water was running low. She had rationed her food carefully, eating only 1 biscuit and a few beans that day. The trail was poorly marked, and she had to trust her sense of direction and the position of the sun to keep heading south. On the 3rd day, her water ran out completely. She had found a small creek that morning, but it was so muddy and foul-smelling that she dared not drink from it. Her last biscuit was gone, and the beans were too hard to eat without water to soften them. By February day, hunger had become her constant companion. Her stomach cramped and growled, and she felt weak and dizzy. She had begun talking to herself, sometimes reciting poetry she had memorized as a child, sometimes conducting imaginary lessons with imaginary students. Now, on the 5th morning, as she struggled to her feet after her latest fall, Margaret wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The landscape around her looked the same in every direction. Endless red rock and scrub brush under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. She had no idea how far she had come or how far she still had to go. Her hands shook as she picked up her satchel. The books inside felt impossibly heavy now, but she couldn't bring herself to abandon them. They were her credentials, her proof that she was more than just another desperate soul lost in the desert. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up. At first, she thought it might be another hallucination. She had been seeing mirages for the past 2 days, but the sound grew louder and more distinct. Someone was coming. James Big Jim Morrison had been riding the range since before dawn, checking on his cattle spread across the northern section of his vast ranch. At 28, he owned more land than most men could ride across in a week, and his herds numbered in the thousands. Success had come early to Big Jim through a combination of hard work, smart investments, and what some folks called luck, though Jim preferred to think of it as being prepared when opportunity knocked. He had been born Topo Verde in Texas, the son of a failed farmer who drank away what little money the family had. Jim had left home at 14 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to never be poor again. He had worked as a cowhand, a trail driver, and eventually a foreman before saving enough money to buy his first 100 acres in Arizona territory. That was 10 years ago. Now, the Circulum Ranch sprawled across 30,000 acres of prime grazing land, and Big Jim Morrison was considered one of the wealthiest men in the territory. He had built a fine house with real glass windows and imported furniture, though he still preferred to spend most of his time outdoors with his cattle and horses. This morning's ride had been routine until he spotted something unusual in the distance, a dark speck moving slowly across the desert floor. Jim pulled out his field glasses and focused on the spot. What he saw made him spur his horse into a gallop. A woman was walking, stumbling, across the desert, clearly in distress. As he got closer, Jim could see that she was young, probably in her 20s, with dark hair that had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in. Her dress was torn and dusty, and she moved with the unsteady gait of someone near collapse. Just as Jim reached the crest of a small hill, the woman fell forward and didn't get up. He reached her in minutes, dismounting quickly and kneeling beside her still form. She was breathing, but barely conscious. Her skin was hot to the touch and her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Her clothes marked her as someone from back east. The dress was well made, but completely unsuitable for desert travel. "Ma'am," Jim sagently, lifting her head slightly. "Mum, can you hear me?" Margaret's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she stared at him in confusion. Through her delirium, she saw a tall man with kind brown eyes and a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His shirt was dusty but clean, and his hands though calloused were gentle as they supported her. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible. Jim immediately reached for his canteen. Supporting her head, Ash brought it to her lips. "Easy now," he said softly. "Just sip it slow. Too much too fast will make you sick." The water was the most wonderful thing Margaret had ever tasted. She wanted to gulp it down, but the man's firm hand controlled the flow, forcing her to take small, careful sips. "That's it," he said encouragingly. "You're going to be fine now." After a few minutes, Margaret felt strong enough to sit up with his help. She looked around at the endless desert, then back at her rescuer. I thought I was going to die," she said, her voice still. "Not on my watch," Jim replied with a slight smile. "Name's James Morrison, but folks call me Big Jim. What's a lady like you doing out here all alone?" Margaret tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. Jim caught her easily and helped her sit back down. "I'm Margaret O'Brien," she said. "I was walking to Tombstone." Jim's eyebrows rose. Walking from where? Copper Creek, Margaret replied, and saw recognition flash in his eyes. That's near 100 miles from here, Jim said, his voice filled with amazement and concern. And you've been walking it alone? Margaret nodded, suddenly feeling foolish. Put that way, it did sound like madness. I'm a teacher, she said, as if that explained everything. Or I was supposed to be. The position in Copper Creek, it didn't work out. Jim studied her face for a moment, seeing intelligence and determination along with the exhaustion. There was something about this woman that intrigued him. The way she held herself despite her circumstances. The careful way she spoke despite her obvious education being at odds with her current situation. Well, Miss O'Brien, he said finally, Tombstone's still a good 40 miles south of here. And you ain't in any condition to walk another step. My ranch is just over that ridge. How about we get you some food and a place to rest, and then we can figure out what to do next. Margaret looked in the direction he pointed. She could see nothing but more desert, but she had little choice but to trust this stranger. Everything about him suggested he was a man of his word, from his direct gaze to the confident way he carried himself. I don't have any money to pay you, she said quietly, embarrassed by her circumstances. Jim smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face. Did I ask for money? Come on, let's get you up on my horse. Can you ride a little? Margaret admitted. She had ridden as a child back in Massachusetts, though never on anything like the large quarter horse that Jim held over to her. Jim helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. This here's Thunder, he said, patting the horse's neck. He's gentle as a lamb with ladies. He boosted her up into the saddle, then swung up behind her. You just hold on to the saddle horn and don't worry about falling. I won't let it happen. As they rode toward the Circlem Ranch, Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time in days. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the security of Jim's presence behind her made her feel safer than she had since leaving Boston. She could smell the leather of his chaps and the clean scent of soap, evidence that despite his rugged appearance, he was a man who took care of himself. So, you're a teacher, Jim said as they rode. Where'd you go to school? Boston Normal School, Margaret replied. I specialized in literature and arithmetic. Boston, Jim repeated thoughtfully. That's a long way from Arizona territory. What made you come west? Margaret hesitated, then decided there was no point in hiding the truth. My parents died last winter. Consumption. I had debts to settle and no family left. The teaching position seemed like a new beginning. Jim nodded, understanding. I'm sorry for your loss. Consumption's a hard way to go. They rode in comfortable easels for a while, and Margaret began to notice details about the landscape that had escaped her. During her desperate walk, there were more plants than she had realized. Tough, hearty things that had found ways to thrive in this harsh environment. Occasionally, she spotted cattle in the distance, sturdy animals that looked well-fed despite the challenging terrain. How many cattle do you run? She asked. About 3,000 head, Jim replied. Takes a lot of land to support them out here. Each cow needs about 20 acres of range to find enough grass. Margaret did the quick calculation in her head. That's 60,000 acres, Jim chuckled. You really are a teacher, aren't you? Most folks can't do arithmetic that fast. Actually, I run them on about 30,000 acres, rotating the herds to different sections so the grass can recover. As they crested a low hill, Margaret saw the Circlem Ranch spread out below them, and she gasped in surprise. This was not the rough frontier homestead she had expected. The main house was a substantial two-story structure with a wrap-around porch and real glass windows. Outbuildings dotted the property, a large barn, corral, a bunkhouse, and several smaller structures she called in Tidnafy. You build all this? She asked, unable to hide her amazement. Started with 100 acres and a dozen cattle 10 years ago. Jim said with obvious pride. Every building you see, either built myself or supervised the building of that barn. There can hold hay for 500 head through the winter. As they approached the house, Margaret noticed several men working around the property. They all touched their hats respectfully when they saw Jim, but their eyes were curious as they took in his passenger. Don't mind the boys, Jim said quietly. They're good men, but they ain't used to seeing ladies out here. Most of them have been with me for years. Jim brought Thunder to a stop in front of the main house and dismounted, then helped Margaret down. Her legs were still unsteady, and she had to lean on his arm for support. "Rosa," Jim called toward the house. "Rosa, we've got company." A Mexican woman appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that immediately assessed Margaret's condition. "Ay Dios, Rosa said, hurrying down the steps. "What happened to this poor child?" "Found her collapsed in the desert," Jim explained. "Been walking from Copper Creek to Tombstone. She needs food, water, and rest." Rosa immediately took charge, supporting Margaret's other arm. "You come with me, Mija," she said gently. "We'll get you cleaned up and fed. Senior Jim, you tell Cookie to make some of his beef broth, something light for her stomach." As Rosa led her toward the house, Margaret looked back at Jim. "Thank you," she said simply. "No need for thanks," Jim replied. Any decent person would do the same. But as Margaret disappeared into the house with Rosa, Jim stood for a long moment looking after her. There had been something in her eyes, a combination of vulnerability and strength that he found compelling. Most women he knew would have broken down completely under circumstances. But Margaret O'Brien had maintained her dignity and composure, even in the face of near death. He shook his head and headed toward the bunkhouse to speak with Cookie about preparing something suitable for their unexpected guest. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret O'Brien's arrival at his ranch was going to change things in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Rosa Delgado had been the housekeeper at the Circle M Ranch for 5 years, ever since her husband Miguel had been hired as Jim's foreman. She had raised 6 children of her own and had an natural instinct for nurturing that extended to anyone who needed care. One look at Margaret told her this young woman needed more than just food and rest. She needed healing, both physical and emotional. "You sit here, Mija," Rosa said, guiding Margaret to a chair in the spacious kitchen. The room was warm and welcoming with copper pots hanging from hooks, and the smell of baking bread filling the air. "Let me look at your feet." Margaret winced as Rosa knelt and carefully removed her worn boots. Thelother had rubbed her feet raw in several places, and there were blisters that had burst and become infected. "I proshita," Rosa murmured, shaking her head. "How many days you walk like this?" 5 days, Margaret admitted, embarrassed by the state of her feet. Rosa clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "These boots, they are no good for walking in the desert. We must clean these wounds and put medicine on them." She bustled around the kitchen, gathering supplies. "First though, you need to drink more water slowly and eat something gentle for your stomach." Cookie arrived a few minutes later, a grizzled old cowhand who served as the ranch cook. Despite his rough appearance, he had a reputation for being able to cook anything from beans and bacon to elaborate meals for special occasions. "Heard we got a lady needs some delicate food," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Got some good beef broth simmering, and I can make some soft biscuits to go with it." "That would be perfect," Rosa replied. "And maybe some of that applesauce you made yesterday." As Cookie went to work, Rosa tended to Margaret's feet, cleaning the wounds with warm water and applying a healing salve she made from dessert plants. The touch was gentle but thorough, and Margaret found herself relaxing despite the discomfort. "You are very kind," Margaret said quietly. "Both you and Murdoch Morrison. I don't know how to repay such kindness." Rosa looked up from her work with a smile. "Kindness is not something that needs to be repaid, Maya. It is something that should be passed on to others when you are able." "Have ya worked for Mr. Morrison long?" Margaret asked, curious about her rescuer. 5 years now," Rosa replied, wrapping Margaret's feet in clean bandages. "He's a good man, a fair boss. He treats his workers well, pays good wages, never asks us to do anything he wouldn't do himself." "Is he married?" Margaret asked, then immediately felt her cheeks flush at the personal nature of the question. Rosa chuckled knowingly. "No, Mika, he is not married. Many ladies in Tucson and Phoenix have tried to catch his attention, but Senior Jim, he is very particular. He says he is too busy building his ranch to think about a wife." Cookie returned with a bowl of fragrant beef broth and a plate of soft biscuit still warm from the oven. "Here you go, miss," he said with obvious pride. "This will put some strength back in you." The first spoonful of broth was like heaven to Margaret's empty stomach. She had to force herself to eat slowly, savoring each bite. The biscuits were light and buttery, unlike anything she had ever tasted. "This is wonderful," she said sincerely. "I've never had such delicious food." Cookie beamed with pleasure. "Well, you just eat up, miss. There's plenty more where that came from." As Margaret ate, Rosa began asking gentle questions about her background and circumstances. Margaret found herself telling the older woman about her parents' death, her journey west, and the disappointment she had found in Copper Creek. "So, you are a teacher," Rosa said thoughtfully. "That is a valuable skill, especially out here where there are so few educated people." "I'm not sure it's valuable enough," Margaret replied sadly. "The people in Copper Creek couldn't afford to pay me, and I don't know if things will be any better in Tombstone. Tombstone is a rough town." Rosa said with a frown, "Full of miners and gamblers and men with guns. Not a good place for a respectable lady alone." Before Margaret could respond, Jim appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had cleaned up since their ride, changing Guido a fresh shirt and combing his hair. Margaret noticed for the first time how handsome he was when he wasn't covered in trail dust. "How's our patient doing?" he asked, his eyes taking in Margaret's improved appearance. "Much better, thanks to Rosa and Cookie," Margaret replied. "I can't thank you enough for your hospitality." Jim waved off her thanks. "Rosa, how are her feet?" "Bad, but they will heal," Rosa replied. "She needs to rest for several days, maybe a week before she should do any walking." Jim nodded, then looked at Margaret seriously. "Miss O'Brien, I've been thinking about your situation while I was tending to some ranch business. I've got a proposition for you if you're interested in hearing it." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "What kind of proposition?" "Well," Jim said, settling into a chair across from her, "the truth is, I've been thinking about hiring a teacher for the ranch. Most of my hands can't read or write, and that's a disadvantage when it comes to keeping records, understanding contracts, that sort of thing. A smart ranch operation needs educated people." Margaret stared at him in surprise. "You want to hire Meadow teach your cowboys to read and write?" "That's part of it," Jim said. "But there's more. I've been corresponding with some other ranchers about starting a school for the children in this area. There are maybe a dozen families within a 20-mile radius, and their kids are growing up without any education. We've been talking about pooling our resources to build a schoolhouse and hire a proper teacher." "You would do that?" Margaret asked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "It's good business," Jim replied practically. "Educated workers are better workers, and educated children grow up to be productive citizens. Besides," he added with a smile, "I believe every child deserves a chance to learn regardless of where they're born." Margaret felt tears threatening to spill over. After days of despair and desperation, here was not just rescue, but opportunity. Exactly the kind of opportunity she had dreamed of when she left Boston. "What would the salary be?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. $40 a month to start, plus room and board," Jim said. "The other ranchers would contribute to your salary once the school is established. Eventually, you might make as much as $60 or $70 a month." It was more money than Margaret had ever expected to earn. In Boston, she would have been lucky to find a teaching position that paid $25 a month. "Where would I live?" she asked. "We've got a small house about a mile from the main house," Jim explained. "It was built for a foreman who left a couple years ago. It's got 2 rooms, a fireplace, and a well. Rosa could help you fix it up however you like." Margaret looked around the kitchen at Rosa and Cookie, both of whom were watching her with encouraging smiles. These people were offering her not just employment, but acceptance, community, a place to belong. "When would you want me to start?" she asked. "Well, you need to recover your strength first," Jim said. "But if you're agreeable, we could start with some basic lessons for the ranch hands in about a week. I've already got slates and primers ordered from Tucson. They should arrive any day now." Margaret took a deep breath. It was a risk, certainly. She would be committing herself to life in a harsh frontier environment, far from anything she had known. But what alternative did she have? Even if she made it to Tombstone, there was no guarantee she would find work. And from what Rosa had said, it didn't sound like a place where a respectable woman would be safe. "Mr. Morrison," she said formally, "I accept your proposition." Jim's face lit up with a genuine smile. "That's wonderful news, Miss O'Brien. Welcome to the Circulum Ranch." Rosa clapped her hands together in delight. "This is very good. It will be nice to have another woman around here. And the men, they will benefit so much from learning to read and write." Cookie nodded enthusiastically. "About time we had some culture around this place. Maybe you can teach some of the yahoos some manners while you're at it." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself drawn into conversations about the ranch, the surrounding area, and the practical details of establishing both adult education, classes, and eventually a proper school. Jim proved to be not just successful, but thoughtful with clear ideas about education and community development that impressed her with their sophistication. "I've been reading about agricultural colleges back east," he told her as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and red. "Places where men can learn scientific farming and animal husbandry. I think the future of ranching is going to depend on education as much as hard work." "That's a very progressive attitude," Margaret observed. "Most people out here seem to think book learning is useless for practical work." "Those people are wrong," Jim said firmly. "I can read and write and do figure speckhouse. My mother insisted on it. Even though we were poor as church mice, it's made all the difference in my success. I can read contracts, understand market reports, keep proper books. The hands who can't read red have to take my word for everything, and that puts them at a disadvantage." Margaret was impressed by his reasoning. Here was a man who understood that education was empowerment not just for individuals, but for entire communities. "What about the other ranchers who want to support the school?" she asked. "Are they all in agreement about this?" "Most of them," Jim replied. "John Weatherby over at the WW has 3 young ones who need schooling. Sam Patterson's got 2 boys and a girl. There are others. The challenge is going to be building the schoolhouse and getting the children together regularly. Some of these families are pretty spread out. We could start with a traveling shul," Margaret suggested thoughtfully. "I could spend a few days at each ranch teaching the children there, then move on to the next one. Eventually, as the community grows, we could centralize it." Jim looked at her with admiration. "That's a fine idea. Shows you're thinking practically about the challenges." As the stars began to appear in the desert sky, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't experienced since before her parents' death. Here, in this unlikely place, she had found not just safety, but purpose. The terror of her walk through the desert was already beginning to seem like a necessary trial that had led her to exactly where she needed Tobe. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I intend to earn every penny of the salary you're offering. I won't let you down." Jim turned to look at her, struck once again by the quiet strength in her voice. "Miss O'Brien," he replied, "I have a feeling you're going to exceed every expectation we have." Neither of them could have predicted how prophetic those words would prove to be. The first week of Margaret's recovery passed quickly. Rosa fussed over her like a mother hen, ensuring she ate regular meals and rested properly. By the 4th day, Margaret's feet had healed enough for her to walk around the ranch buildings, and she began to get a real sense of the operation Jim had built. The Circulum was impressive by any standard. The main house was solidly constructed, with thick adobe walls that kept it cool during the day and warm at night. The furniture was well made and comfortable, much of it crafted by local artisans. Jim's office contained an extensive library that surprised Margaret with its scope. Books on animal husbandry, agriculture, business, and literature filled the shelves. "I order books from San Francisco and Denver," Jim explained when he found her examining his collection. "Education doesn't stop when you leave school. In my opinion, the ranch employed 12 full-time hands plus seasonal workers during roundup and branding time. Miguel Delgado, Rose's husband, served as foreman and had been with Jim almost from the beginning. The other men ranged in age from 18 to 60, and Margaret quickly learned that while they were rough around the edges, they were decent, hard-working people who took pride in their work. Her small house proved to be more comfortable than she had expected. It had been built as a foreman's residence and contained a sitting room with a fireplace, a bedroom, a small kitchen, and even a porch that faced east toward the mountains. Rosa helped her arrange the few possessions she had brought from Boston. and Jim provided basic furniture from storage in the ranch house. "It's not fancy," he apologized as they surveyed the finished result, "but it's solid and private." "It's perfect," Margaret replied honestly. After her ordeal in the desert and the uncertainty of the past months, having her own space felt like an incredible luxury. Her first teaching session with the ranch hands took place on a Sunday afternoon, in the shade of the big cottonwood tree near the bunkhouse. Margaret had spent the previous day preparing lessons and organizing the materials that had arrived from Tucson: slates, chalk, primers, and copybooks. 8 of the 12 hands showed up for the first lesson, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. Most were in their 20s and 30s, men who had grown up working with their hands and had never had the opportunity for formal education. "Now don't nobody laugh at nobody else," Miguel warned the group before Margaret began. "We're all here to learn, and everybody starts somewhere." Margaret began with the basics, the alphabet and simple words related to ranch work. She quickly discovered that several of the men could recognize some letters and even read a few words, while others were starting completely from scratch. "Don't feel discouraged," she told them as they struggled with their first writing exercises. "Learning to read and write is like learning to rope or break horses. It takes practice, but once you get it, you'll wonder how you ever lived without it." Tommy Martinez, the youngest of the hands at 19, proved to be an eager student. "My mama always wanted me to learn to read," he confided to Margaret after the lesson. "She said it would help me make something of myself." "Your mother was right," Margaret replied. "And it's never too late to start." By the end of the first month, Margaret had established a routine that worked well for everyone. She held lessons for the ranch hands 3 times a week, usually in the early evening after the day's work was done. During the day, she worked on developing curriculum for the children's school, and sometimes helped Rosa with household tasks that required reading or writing. Jim had been true to his word about contacting other ranchers, and by late September, Margaret had visited 4 neighboring spreads to assess. Some wanted to send their children to the Cedar Springs school, while others asked if she could help establish similar schools in their areas. "We might have created something bigger than we planned," Jim observed one evening in November as they reviewed a stack of letters from interested families. "Is that a problem?" Margaret asked. "Not a problem," Jim replied thoughtfully, "but it might mean we need to think about expanding sooner than we expected." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch house at a gallop. Jim immediately stood and moved to the window, his hand instinctively moving to the gun belt he wore even around the house. "Riders coming in fast," he said tersely. "That usually means trouble." Miguel appeared at the front door slightly out of breath. "Senor Jim, there's a problem at the Patterson place. Sam sent his boy Tommy to get you. Says there's been an accident." Jimmy was already reaching for his hat and coat. "What kind of accident?" The boy didn't say much, just that his mama sent him to fetch you in the Senorita. "Said they need help bad." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "They want me to come at you." "Sounds like it," Miguel replied. "Tommy said his mama specifically asked for the teacher lady." Jim looked at Margaret. "Seriously, you don't have to come. Night riding can be dangerous, and we don't know what we're heading into." "If Sarah Patterson asked for me specifically, then I'm going," Margaret said firmly. "Give me 2 minutes to get my things." As Margaret hurried to gather her coat and a bag of basic supplies, she realized that this was the first real test of her place in this frontier community. Whatever was happening at the Patterson Ranch, she was being called upon not just as a teacher, but as a neighbor and friend. The ride to the Patterson place took 45 minutes through darkness broken only by starlight and the occasional coyote call. Jim had insisted that Margaret ride Thunder, his most reliable horse, while he took a younger, faster mount. Miguel and 2 other ranch hands accompanied them, all armed and alert. As they approached the Patterson Ranch, Margaret could see lamplight burning in every window of the house. Never a good sign in a community where lamp oil was precious and bedtime usually came early. Sam Patterson met them at the front door, his weathered face etched with worry. "Thank God you came," he said, ushering them inside. "It's our Emma. She's been hurt bad." Inside the Patterson house, Margaret found a scent that made her heart clench with sympathy. 10-year-old Emma Patterson, one of her brightest students, lay unconscious on her parents' bed, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Sarah Patterson sat beside Thebes, holding her daughter's hand and fighting back tears. "What happened?" Jim asked quietly, removing his hat. "She was helping me with the evening chores," Sam explained, his voice tight with emotion. "We were moving some hay bales in the barn when the stack shifted. She got caught underneath one of the bales. It pinned her down before I could get to her." Margaret moved to the bedside and gently examined Emma. The child had a large bruise on her forehead and several scrapes on her arms. But what worried Margaret most was her unconscious state. "How long has she been like this?" Margaret asked. "About 2 hours now," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She woke up right after it happened, seemed confused and dizzy, then just went to sleep and won't wake up." Margaret looked at Jim, seeing her own concern reflected in his eyes. Neither of them was a doctor, but they both recognized the signs of a serious head injury. "The nearest doctor is in Tombstone," Sam said, reading their thoughts. "That's a 12-hour ride each way, and I don't know if Emma can wait that long." "There's old Doc Hensley and Benson," Jim suggested. "That's only about 6 hours from here." "I already sent Billy to fetch him," Sam replied. "But that was 3 hours ago, and there's no telling if he'll be able to come or when he might get here." Margaret knelt beside the bed and took Emma's small hand in hers. The child's skin was cool to the touch and her pulse felt weak but steady. Margaret had no medical training, but she had helped care for her parents during their final illness, and she understood the importance of keeping the patient warm and comfortable. "Sarah, we need to keep her warm, but not too warm," Margaret said gently. "And we should try to wake her every hour or so, just to make sure she's responsive." "I've been trying to wake her," Sarah said desperately. "She just won't open her eyes." Margaret tried a different approach, speaking directly to the unconscious child. "Emma, it's Miss O'Brien. Can you hear me, sweetheart? Your mom and pop are here, and we're all taking care of you." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Emma's eyelids fluttered slightly, and she made a small sound. "Emma," Sarah leaned forward eagerly. "Emma, baby, can you hear me?" The child's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and confused, before closing again. But it was enough to give Ryan in the room hope. "That's good," Margaret said encouragingly. "She's responding to voices. That's every good sign." Jim had been standing quietly near the door, but now he approached the bed. "Sarah, Sam, Margaret's right. The fact that she responds to voices means she's not as badly hurt as we feared. Head injuries can look worse than they are sometimes." "You really think she'll be all right?" Sam asked, the desperation clear in his voice. "I think Emma is a strong girl," Margaret replied carefully. "And I think she has the best parents in the territory taking care of her." For the next several hours, Margaret stayed at Emma's bedside, taking turns with Sarah to monitor the child's condition. Jim and Sam discussed ranch business in low voices, but Margaret could see that Jim's attention was focused on the sick room. Around midnight, Emma woke up more fully, though she was still confused and complained of a headache. But she recognized her parents and even managed a weak smile when she saw Margaret. "Miss O'Brien," Emma whispered, "am I going to miss school?" Margaret felt tears of relief spring to her eyes. "You worry about getting better first, sweetheart. School will be there when you're ready." Doc Hensley arrived just before dawn, a gruff old man who had been practicing frontier medicine for 30 years. He examined Emma thoroughly, asking her questions and testing her responses. "She's got a concussion, no doubt about it," he pronounced finally, "but not as severe as it could have been. She needs rest, quiet, and someone to watch her closely for the next few days. Wake her every few hours to make sure she stays responsive." "Will there be any lasting effects?" Sarah asked anxiously. "Hard to say for certain," Doc Hensley replied honestly. "Head injuries can be tricky, but she's young and strong, and she's already showing good signs of recovery. I'd say the chances are very good that she'll be fine." As Doc Hensley prepared to leave, he pulled Margaret aside. "You did good work here, miss," he said quietly, keeping her warm, monitoring her responses, staying calm. "You might have saved that child's life." "I just did what anyone would do," Margaret replied modestly. "No," the doctor said firmly. "Most people panic in situations like this. You kept your head and did the right things. Ever think about learning some medical skills? This country needs people who can handle emergencies. As the sun rose over the Patterson ranch, Margaret realized that something significant had happened during the long night vigil. She had been tested by Crisis and had proven herself capable of more than just teaching children their letters. More importantly, she had been fully accepted by this frontier family, not as an outsider or hired help, but as a trusted friend and neighbor. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said as Margaret prepared to leave with Jim. "Having you here, knowing what to do, it made all the difference." "Emma is going to be fine," Margaret assured her, "but I want you to send word if you need anything at all. And don't worry about her missing school. I can bring her lessons here until she's ready to come back." The ride back to the Circle M was quiet. Both Margaret and Jim lost in their own thoughts as the morning sun painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and red. Finally, Jim broke the silence. "You were remarkable back there," he said. "The way you stayed calm, knew what to do, kept everyone's spirits up. That little girl is lucky to have a teacher who cares so much." "I was terrified," Margaret admitted. "I kept thinking about what would happen if she didn't wake up, if I was doing the wrong things. But you didn't let that fear stop you from doing what needed to be done," Jim pointed out. "That's the mark of real courage, not the absence of fear, but acting rightly despite it." Margaret looked at him with new appreciation. This man who had built a successful ranch from nothing, who was hoping to establish schools across the territory, had depths of wisdom and sensitivity that continued to surprise her. "Thank you for bringing me," she said. "I know it wasn't necessary, but it meant everything to the Pattersons and told me that you trusted me to help." Margaret, Jim said, using her first name for the first time. "You're not just an employee of this ranch or this community. You're a vital part of what we're building here." Last night proved that beyond any doubt. The use of her first name and the sincerity in his voice made Margaret's heart skip a beat. Over the past months, she had come to respect and admire Jim Morrison, but she had tried to keep their relationship strictly professional. Now, she was beginning to realize that her feelings had grown beyond mere professional admiration. "Jim," she said, testing the sound of his name, "I want you to know that coming here, accepting your offer, has been the best decision I've ever made. For the first time since my parents died, I feel like I belong somewhere." Jim's smile was warm and genuine. "This community is lucky to have you, Margaret, and so am I." The rest of the ride passed in comfortable machines, but Margaret's mind was racing. The crisis at the Patterson ranch had crystallized something she had been trying to ignore: her growing feelings for Jim Morrison. He was everything she had never dared to hope for in a man. Intelligent, successful, kind, and committed to building something meaningful in the world. But what were his feelings toward her? His kindness and respect were evident, but did they extend beyond friendship and professional appreciation? The frontier was a place where practical considerations often outweighed romantic ones, and Margaret couldn't be sure whether Jim's interest in her was personal or simply related to her value as a teacher. As they arrived back at the Circle M, Margaret made a decision. She would continue to focus on her work and her commitment to the community, but she would also be more open to the possibility that something deeper might develop between her and Jim. After all, life in the Arizona territory had already taught her that sometimes the most unexpected paths led to the greatest rewards. The weeks following Emma Patterson's accident brought changes to Margaret's life that she hadn't anticipated. Word of her calm handling of the medical emergency spread through the ranching community, and families began turning to her for help with various problems beyond education. When the Miller family's youngest son came down with fever, they sent for Margaret as well as Doc Hensley. When the Weatherby twins got into a fight that left one with a black eye and the other with a split lip, their parents asked Margaret to mediate. Somehow she had become more than just a teacher. She was becoming a pillar of the small frontier community. "It's because you care," Rosa explained one evening as they prepared dinner together. "These people, they can tell the difference between someone who's just doing a job and someone who truly cares about their well-being." Margaret was flattered by the trust placed in her, but it also created new challenges. Her days were fuller than ever, and she sometimes felt pulled in too many directions. It was Jim who noticed her exhaustion first. "You're taking on too much," he said one evening as Margaret sat at his kitchen table, grading papers by lamplight while Rosa cleaned up from dinner. "These people need help," Margaret replied, not looking up from her work. "I can't turn my back on them." "Nobody's asking you to turn your back on anyone," Jim said gently. "But you can't help anybody if you work yourself into the ground." Margaret set down her pen and rubbed her tired eyes. "I suppose you're right, It's just that there's so much work to be done. So many ways I could help." Jim studied her face in the lamplight, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. "Margaret, you've accomplished more in 6 months than most people do in years. The school is successful. The children are learning. The adults are eager for education. You've earned the respect and trust of every family in this area. Maybe it's time to think about taking care of yourself, too." The concern in his voice touched Margaret deeply. When was the last time someone had worried about her well-being? Since her parents' death, she had been so focused on survival and establishing herself that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about her personal welfare. "What do you suggest?" she asked. "Take a day off," Jim said. "A full day of rest. No grading papers. No visiting families. No planning lessons. Just rest." "I couldn't," Margaret protested. "There's too much to do. The work will still be there." "On Monday," Jim assured her, "and you'll do it better if you're rested. Besides," he added with a smile, "I was hoping you might let me show you some of the prettier parts of the ranch. There are places I think you'd enjoy seeing." Margaret felt her heart flutter at the suggestion. A day spent alone with Jim exploring the countryside sounded both appealing and slightly dangerous to her peace of mind. "That sounds lovely," she heard herself saying. "But what about your own work? Surely you have ranch business to attend to." "The ranch can run itself for one day," Jim replied. "Miguel is perfectly capable of handling anything that comes up." The following Sunday dawned clear and warm with the kind of perfect Arizona weather that made the harsh summers seem worthwhile. Jim arrived at Margaret's small house shortly after sunrise, leading to horses and carrying a picnic basket. "Rosa insisted on packing us lunch," he explained. "She said we'd waste away to nothing if left to our own devices." Margaret laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. She had dressed in her most practical riding outfit, a divided skirt that allowed hair to ride astride and a simple blouse that wouldn't show dust. Her hair was braided back in a practical style that would survive a day outdoors. "You look perfect for a day of exploring," Jim said, and Margaret felt herself blush at the compliment. They rode southwest from the ranch house, following a trail that wound through increasingly spectacular scenery. Jim proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out landmarks, wildlife, and plants of interest. His knowledge of the desert was extensive, and Margaret found herself fascinated by his stories of the land's history and his own experiences building the ranch. This whole area was Apache territory until about 10 years ago, Jim explained as they paused at a scenic overlook. They didn't farm or ranch the land the way we do, but they knew every water source, every game trail, every safe place to camp. "Dost you ever see them now?" Margaret asked, scanning the horizon. "Occasionally," Jim replied. "Most of the bands have been moved to reservations, but there are still some small groups living in the mountains. They're not usually hostile. They just want to be left alone." As the morning progressed, Margaret found herself relaxing completely for the first time in months. The combination of Jim's easy company, the beautiful scenery, and the absence of any pressing responsibilities was like a tonic to her overworked spirit. They stopped for lunch beside a small spring surrounded by cottonwood trees, a green oasis in the red rock landscape. Rosa had packed enough food for a small army: cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, pickles, and even a small apple pie. "Rosa spoils us," Jim said as he spread a blanket in the shade. "She takes care of people she loves," Margaret replied, then realized the implications of her words. Did Rosa consider her part of family? Did Jim? "Yes, she does," Jim agreed quietly. "Rosa has a gift for seeing what people need before they know it themselves." As they ate, their conversation ranged over many topics: books, travel, dreams for the future. Margaret discovered that Jim was better read than many college-educated men she had known. and his perspectives on everything from politics to philosophy were thoughtful and well-informed. I sometimes wonder what my life would have been like if I'd been born to different circumstances. Jim asked as they finished their meal. If I'd had the chance for formal education, maybe gone to college back east. Do you regret not having those opportunities? Margaret asked. Jim considered the question seriously. But then I look at what I've built here, the life I've made, and I think maybe things worked out the way they were supposed to. What about you? Do you ever regret leaving Boston? Margaret thought about her comfortable life in Massachusetts, the security of familiar surroundings, the cultural advantage of city life. Then she thought about the past 6 months, the challenges, the rewards, the sense of purpose she had found. No, she said firmly, I don't regret it at all. This life is harder than what I left behind, but it's also more meaningful. In Boston, I would have been just another spinster teacher in a city full of teachers. Here, I feel like I'm making a real difference. You are making a difference, Jim said. Seriously, more than you know. Something in his tone made Margaret look at him more closely. There was an intensity in his eyes that made her breath catch. Margaret, Jim said quietly, there's something I need to tell you. Margaret's heart began to race. Was he about to say what she had been hoping to hear for weeks? Over the past months, Jim continued, watching you work, seeing how you've become part of this community, getting to know you as a person. I've come to care for you in ways that go beyond friendship or professional respect. Margaret felt as if the world had suddenly become very still and quiet. Jim, let me finish, he said gently. I know this complicates things. You work for me in a sense, and I don't want you to feel pressured in any way. But I had to tell you how I feel. I've grown to love you, Margaret, and I wanted you to know. Margaret stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she had heard. You love me. Yes, Jim said simply. I love your intelligence, your compassion, your courage. I love the way you care about people, the way you've thrown yourself into building something meaningful here. I love the person you are, Margaret O'Brien. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes, tears of joy and relief and overwhelming emotion. Jim, I've been trying so hard not to care for you too much, thinking it would be inappropriate, thinking you could never see me as more than an employee. And I now, Jim asked softly. Now I can tell you that I love you, too, Margaret whispered. I think I've been in love with you for weeks, maybe months, but I was afraid to admit it even to myself. Jim reached for her hands, taking them gently in his own. Margaret, I want you to know that this doesn't change anything about your position here, about the school, about your independence, whether you return my feelings or not. You have a place in this community that you've earned on your own merits. But I do return your feelings, Margaret said, tears streaming down her cheeks. Oh, Jim, I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. Jim leaned forward and kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion as Margaret responded. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything she had dreamed it might be, tender, exciting, and full of promise for the future. When they finally broke apart, Jim rested his forehead against hers. Margaret, will you marry me? Margaret felt her heart soar with joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes, of course, I'll marry you. As they held each other beside the desert spring, Margaret marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a desperate woman collapsing in the desert with no hope and no future. Now she was engaged to marry a man she respected and loved in a place where she had found purpose and community. When she asked practically, and where? And what about the school? Jim laughed at her rapid-fire questions. Whenever you want, wherever you want, and the school will continue exactly as it is. In fact, as my wife, you'll have even more support for expanding the educational programs. Your wife, Margaret, repeated wonderingly. I can hardly believe it. Believe it, Jim said, kissing her again. We're going to build a wonderful life together, Margaret. The ranch, the school, maybe a family of our own someday. As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Margaret knew that her new life was just beginning. The desperate teacher who had walked 100 miles through the desert had found not just survival, but love, purpose, and a future beyond her wildest dreams. The journey that had started with desperation and near death had led her to the greatest happiness. she had ever known. And as Jim held her in his arms beside the desert spring, Margaret understood that sometimes the most difficult paths lead to the most beautiful destinations. Spring 1892. Margaret Morrison stood on the porch of the Circlem Ranch house, watching her husband and 3-year-old son Danny play in the yard. Danny had Jim's brown eyes and Margaret's determined spirit, and he was already showing signs of the intelligence that ran in both family lines. The ranch had prospered under Jim's continued leadership, now spanning 40,000 acres and supporting nearly 5,000 head of cattle. But the growth Margaret was most proud of was in the educational programs they had established together. The Cedar Springs School now served 32 students from 15 different families, with Margaret as the head teacher and 2 assistant teachers she had trained. They had also established a lending library, adult education programs, and even a small teacher training institute that attracted young women from across the territory. Emma Patterson, fully recovered from her childhood accident, was now Margaret's star pupil and planned to attend the Territorial University in Tucson. Billy Patterson, once reluctant to learn, had become fascinated with mathematics and was helping his father expand their ranch operation. Using scientific methods, "Mama, Papa's teaching me to rope," Danny called out, waving a small lariat that Jim had made for him. "I see that, sweetheart," Margaret called back. "Just remember what we talked about. Practice makes perfect." Rosa appeared beside Margaret on the porch carrying a tray of lemonade. "That boy is going to be just like his papa," she observed with a smile. "Heaven help us all," Margaret lauded, but her voice was full of love and pride. In her pocket, Margaret carried a letter that had arrived that morning from the Territorial Education Department. They wanted to use the Cedar Springs School as a model for rural education throughout Arizona, and they had invited Margaret to speak at the Territorial Education Conference in Phoenix. It was a far cry from the desperate woman who had collapsed in the desert 5 years ago. That woman had been running from loss and disappointment with no idea of what the future might hold. This woman was running toward opportunity and growth, secure in the love of her family and the respect of her community. Mrs. Morrison called a voice from the road. Margaret looked up to see a young woman approaching on horseback, dusty and tired from travel. There was something familiar about the scene. A woman alone traveling through dangerous country, clearly at the end of her resources. "Can I help you?" Margaret called out, already moving toward the gate. "I heard there might be teaching work in these parts," the woman said hopefully. "I'm Sarah Wilson from Colorado. I've got experience with children and I can read and write real well." Margaret smiled, remembering another desperate teacher who had once walked 100 miles looking for work. "Miss Wilson, I think you've come to exactly the right place. Why don't you come up to the house and we'll talk about what opportunities might be available." As Sarah Wilson dismounted and approached the porch, Margaret caught Jim's eye across the yard. He smiled and nodded, understanding without words that their family was about to grow again, just as it had grown to include Margaret herself 5 years ago. The Arizona Territory was still a hard land that demanded strength and determination from those who chose to make their lives there. But it was also a land of opportunity where people could build new lives and find purposes they had never imagined. Margaret Morrison, formerly Margaret O'Brien, had learned that sometimes the most desperate journeys lead to the most wonderful destinations. And as she welcomed another lost teacher into her home, she knew that the story was continuing, with new chapters being written by each person brave enough to walk into the unknown desert in search of a better life. The sun was setting over the Circlem Ranch, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that had become as familiar and beloved to Margaret as her own heartbeat. In the distance, she could hear the lowing of cattle, the sound of cowboys calling to each other as they finished the day's work, and the laughter of her son as he played with his father. It was the sound of home, of family, of dreams fulfilled and new dreams beginning. Margaret had found her place in the world, and it was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined during